Hey, what's going on, Xbox and PC fans? Haven't started off the video with that in quite a while, I know, but since this is an Xbox video, PC guys, stick around if you want to learn some, about the architectures, how they relate to PC components, etc. This is an x86 box. Obviously, the Xbox is utilizing, DirectX technologies, the, group of APIs that Microsoft bundles in there. DirectX includes things like Direct 3D for graphics, direct APIs for controller input, sound, etc., etc., etc. So this is PC. I don't want to say specific, but it is related to PC stuff. So if you guys want to tune in, that's cool. If not, if you're only into PC stuff, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out early. So other than that, Xbox guys, stick around. It's going to be an awesome video. It's going to be a long video, but I want to really elaborate on basically everything with the Xbox One, how that relates to the PlayStation 4, and how those differences really equate to the largest, or one of the largest, arguably in the history of consoles in terms of a technological and experience to the end user in terms of a gap, and what, again, end users will see, and just the technology that's in the two most prominent consoles for years to come, the PlayStation 4 Pro from Sony versus the Xbox One X from Microsoft, and really what that means. And again, to go over and above, what the spec sheet says, and elaborate that, and tell you guys why the spec sheet alone doesn't really do justice in showing you and explaining to you the massive gap that exists there, and what that means for consumers. So I'm going to basically spend most of the time talking about those two consoles. Before I do that, I want to run you guys back in time a little bit, well, a long time, probably before a lot of you guys maybe even were gamers. I'm an old man, but I've been playing games for a long time. I remember back in 2002 when the PlayStation 2 launched. A year later, the first Xbox launched, and there were a ton of players on PlayStation 2 at the time. It was a great console in a vacuum. It's like if the Xbox never came out, the PlayStation 2 would have been considered a powerhouse for its day. It came with, the Emotion engine, basically was a CPU that was co-developed by Sony and Toshiba. And the GameCube did have a little bit more powerful hardware, but it was kind of unorthodox in how it was set up. And for the sake of this video, I'm going to leave Nintendo out of the conversation and just talk about how these two companies, which really are relevant in the home console space today, kind of have competed and are competing in today's console environment. So PlayStation 2, again, a great CPU for the time. The GPU really on that console was meant to push polygons and to apply textures to those polygons. That was about it. It had 32 megabytes of system RAM. It had 4 megabytes of high-speed DRAM, almost kind of like a cache that is used as ESRAM on the Xbox One, or there was a chunk of cache on the GameCube GPU. So it's not without precedent. Even I think before that point people were doing that, but that 4 megabytes of cache, additional kind of high-speed memory for the PlayStation 2 graphics processor really didn't allow them enough space to do things like any type of anti-aliasing, and that GPU didn't have any kind of way to accelerate things like hardware, accelerated lighting, bump mapping, pixel shading, etc. There was no hard drive in the PlayStation 2 that was standard for developers to leverage to do things like streaming in game assets during gameplay, eliminating loading screens, saving replays for sports games, for halftime shows, etc. on the hard drive, where there's only so much memory that resides in the PlayStation 2. Again, 32 megabytes and 4 megabytes of DRAM. So you can't write to an optical media disk. There's nowhere else to put this information. So they could do very little in the way of replays and stuff like that. There just wasn't enough space in that little chunk of, volatile memory, and no hard drive for developers to be able to store that stuff, and they had to stream all their game assets right off the DVD. So one other thing is there was not really any standard kind of connection for online gameplay. PlayStation Now did exist, but it was 56K dial-up for the vast majority of people. Those people that did have broadband internet connections really didn't even benefit from that because of the fact that the vast majority of players on PSN were utilizing a phone line, and they had a ton of lag. Even if you had a broadband connection, 9 out of 10 players in the multiplayer game are rubber banding all over the map, and you can't shoot anybody. It was really, really bad. It was a free service, but it was a horrible free service. And by comparison, a year later when the Xbox came out, the first Xbox, this is the last time that I can recall a gap in technology that's anywhere close to what we're going to see with the PlayStation 4 Pro and the Xbox One X moving forward. So the Xbox One, the first generation of Xbox, came with not a custom CPU like the Emotion CPU in the PlayStation 2. It came with basically commodity off-the-shelf PC parts, albeit slightly modified for use in the console, but essentially you had a Pentium 3 running at 733 megahertz. You had 64 megabytes, so twice as much system RAM available. You had a standard hard drive in every single system for developers to use to have basically infinite number of save games. You could stream data off of the hard drive, from the optical media drive to the hard drive, and then have those assets streamed into the game during gameplay to eliminate or greatly reduce loading screens. You could store, again, a lot more information. So you could store the whole first half of the football game if you wanted for replays. You had a space on the hard drive to do that. It enabled some things that the PlayStation 2 simply couldn't do just by having the hard drive standardized in every unit. On top of that, you had Xbox Live, which every Xbox console came with a 10100 Ethernet port on it. You had to have broadband to play online, so that meant that every single player on Xbox Live had a broadband connection, and by virtue of that, every single match that you played, every single game that you played in a multiplayer environment was just vastly superior. You didn't have some guy that was in the middle of a country or urban environment somewhere. No knocking to those guys, but they were using phone line modems that had a ton of lag, and they really brought down the experience for players playing on PlayStation Network at the time. And the best thing for last, the biggest differentiator between those two consoles was clearly the GPU. The graphics processor, again on the PlayStation 2, was not set up to do any kind of hardware-based acceleration of lighting, did not allow for things like shading of individual pixels. The first Xbox, Microsoft went to NVIDIA and they said, listen, we want the next level of hardware. We want to push the envelope even for PC in terms of graphics, and we want you to develop for us basically a completely custom solution in terms of a GPU, and they did that. They paid a pretty penny as well, Microsoft did, to NVIDIA. Later had disputes about money owed, etc., and that was settled out of court, but they made them a whale of a GPU. At the time it had, I think, 4 pixel and 2 vertex shaders, and was able to do things that the PlayStation 2 graphics processor simply couldn't do, such as anti-aliasing, which is 640 by 480 standard VGA resolution with both these consoles rendered out back in the day. Some Xbox games actually rendered at 720p, but at those resolutions, anti-aliasing made a massive difference to overall image quality. They were also able to do things with regard to texturing that the PlayStation 2 simply could not do, such as bump mapping and shading individual pixels and lighting based on, the angle in which you're looking at an object. So I remember games like Halo and Splinter Cell where you could see basically from different angles things like parallax mapping. I don't know if that was included in Shader Model 3.0 or not on that console, but more advanced features that made the games look dramatically different. Helmets on players in Madden, if there was a stadium light, they would reflect that light appropriately based on, where the players were relative to the light and how it bounced off of them, and et cetera, et cetera. The muscles in their arms you could see because, again, that's not necessarily a higher polygon count, but the way that the textures were handled and the way the shading of those individual pixels on those textures was able to be manipulated by these vertex shaders. And it made it so you didn't have to be a nerd or a tech or a very, savvy individual in terms of gaming or graphics, etc. But you could walk by, your grandma could walk by the TV and somebody on the PlayStation 2 playing the exact same game as they had on the Xbox. And, even grandma would say, that version looks a lot better than what's on the screen over here. And if you were playing an online match, it would be the very same thing. The quality of the matches were dramatically different, and the network experience. One other area, even above all the rest of this stuff, which was absolutely huge, is they both did have DVD players. So they had parity on that one item. The optical media disc, the physical disc, they could both play DVDs, and they were, they had parity in that one area. The PlayStation 2 could certainly provide 5.1 positional surround sound audio, a DVD playback, but it couldn't do 5.1 positional audio in a game. The first time that, a mass consumer product was able to do that was the first Xbox. The first Xbox was able to process 5.1 digital surround sound in a game. And I remember playing Halo, and again, you could see, if you kind of rotated around the Master Chief, you could see those graphic shaders showing bullet holes and pop marks and scratches on his armor and reflective surfaces that simply weren't possible on the PlayStation 2. And you could also hear, I remember my buddy had a great surround system, and hearing, the flood or, your enemies behind you to the left, and you turn around, and that's exactly where they are. Having accurate positional audio as opposed to just two-channel stereo in games made an absolutely massive difference. And when Halo 2 launched, the disparity between the online networks, the graphics, the sheer capabilities of those two boxes became apparent to everyone. That was one of the biggest launches in video game history that I can remember being a part of. And that was really an inflection point in gaming, period. Not just consoles, but PC players at the time even. And I've been one my whole life as well. If you had been a PC gamer strictly, you would not have been wrong to have, I don't want to say be jealous, but to be, wanton after what Halo 2 provided in terms of multiplayer experience. It was that good. Matchmaking was that solid. Again, every single person had to have a broadband connection, whereas even on the PC, if you were in a multiplayer match, there's no rule against, Joe Schmo who has a 56K modem or even a 28 modem dial-up connection hopping into your multiplayer game, unless you set some kind of parameter for it. But anyway, the Xbox versus the PlayStation 2, like I say, in every other category besides the optical media, both having DVD players, it was an absolute runaway for the Xbox in terms of the experience to the end user, in terms of how those games looked, how they played online, custom soundtracks in your games. It's still tough to get that, but it was a huge difference, and that really was something Microsoft needed at the time. With obviously, two incumbents embedded in the console gaming space with Nintendo and Sony. They had to basically make that statement and come out, and they really delivered in terms of a powerful box with vastly superior capabilities to what was available in the market at that time. Now, I'm going to touch real quick on the next two generations here, and then I'm going to get into the Xbox One X versus the PlayStation 4 Pro. But the Xbox 360, I want to say it launched slightly ahead of the PlayStation 3, and they both used PowerPC cores for the CPU. The Xbox 360 used 3 dual-threaded PowerPC RISC-based cores. Same clock speed, I think it was 3.2 gigahertz as the cell-based processor in the PlayStation 3, but it had a 512 megabyte, basically one large pool of system memory developers could use, allocate however they wanted. It had a custom GPU designed by AMD, 48 shader pipelines. It was the first time in the history of any GPU that we saw a unified shader architecture, meaning that developers could say, all right, shader, I want you to work on pixels or on vertex operations. There was not a set function, and they were able to kind of, if they needed more polygons, they could go for one kind of processing. If they needed more shading to pixels, they could utilize more of those for those type of tasks. Now, there is a disparity in this console generation in terms of what came in the box. The Xbox 360 only had a DVD player. Did have an add-on, high definition DVD player, which would have given you parity in terms of a visual experience, even though the Blu-ray player and the PlayStation 3 obviously won out in the long term. But you could get parity there with a peripheral if you wanted to, but not with a standard unit. The the audio, the online play got better on PlayStation 3. I still wouldn't say it was anywhere near what Xbox Live was, but let's just say for the most part, outside of the optical media drive, you had parity in terms of hardware. Now, the PlayStation 3, utilizing a cell processor, had one, kind of a multi-threaded single PowerPC processor, as well as 7 SPUs on them, which were really designed for like parallel processing, almost kind of like a DSP, things that come in and the stream it decodes very quickly, like audio and video. But it wasn't as easy to develop for. Developers really had to kind of spoon feed those SPUs, whereas the more general purpose CPUs on the Xbox 360, all of which had out-of-order execution, branch prediction, etc., things a normal CPU would have, allowed it to be much more developer friendly and better suited for things like random AI and things of that nature. And it just, because it got a larger initial user base, I think that that's a lot of the reason developer support kind of fell behind that console as its primary development platform, the Xbox 360, and the PlayStation 3 as a result really suffered with lower resolutions in most titles, and really only showed its true potential in certain first-party titles like God of War and other games of that time. But the PS3 did also have equivalent memory in terms of the amount. It had 512 megabytes of system memory. They were all located, I think, cut in half. Part for the system was one kind of memory, and part for the graphics was another kind of memory. So developers didn't really have the same kind of freedom there as they have with the Xbox 360, having 512 megabytes of just do whatever you want with the stuff. Leave enough for the OS, but use the rest wherever you feel, however you want. Same thing with the GPU. And this kind of speaks to the whole PS3. Just a lot harder to program for. The CPU, the memory, being divided in half, And then the GPU was a GPU developed by NVIDIA. I think it had 24 shaders total. Um, only half the number as they had in the Xbox 360, but certainly more powerful per shader, as NVIDIA, GPUs or shaders typically are. But they were, set function. There was, I think, 16 pixel and 8 vertex shader, something like that. So they couldn't, allocate resources in that fashion as they saw fit. Just making the Xbox 360, again, a much more developer-friendly console, and easier to kind of get what you wanted out of that box versus the PlayStation 3. With that being said, and I already mentioned the disparity in resolution for most games, a lot of games saw a slight resolution advantage on the Xbox 360, also probably in performance in terms of frame rate, because it was the primary, console that developers really said we're going to focus on this console first, and then we'll port it over to PlayStation 3 after. And again, having to really hand feed the cell process with those SPUs and having to, more stringent or not as flexible use of the GPU and the memory subsystem just made it harder for them to achieve, parity in terms of resolution and also frame rate, relative to the Xbox 360. Now, that being said, there was a large amount of parity, almost basically complete parity, in terms of what was being rendered on the screen. So what textures shipped on the disc, the level of detail, the draw distances, the lighting in the games, etc., looked almost identical. And again, that just wasn't the case with the PS2 and the first Xbox. The games looked tremendously different. The next generation, and I know it's the same generation that we're still in, but the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4 Pro, and these are almost apples to apples because they're both x86 CPUs, both based on the Jaguar architecture, both 8 cores, and you have a lot of similarities there between basically all the components of these systems. So going over the Xbox One first, of course, like I said, 8-core, Jaguar-based, CPU, clocked in at 1.75 gigahertz. You have the GPU, which I think has 768 shader cores, I think, clocked at like 853, something like that. But you get 1.3 teraflops because there's fewer shaders on that box than there are on the PlayStation 4. Now, memory-wise, you get 8 gigabytes of DDR3, low latency, not as high bandwidth, but they do rely on that 32 megabyte chunk of basically GPU cache, the ES RAM, for high bandwidth effects such as anti-aliasing. They utilize that little frame buffer there for high bandwidth applications. So both have Blu-ray disc, players. Both have, very, I would say, sound multiplayer at this point, even though I definitely still give the advantage to, Xbox Live, and I'll tell you more about that and why at the end of the video. But the PlayStation 4 had a little bit less powerful CPU, same basic architecture, came in at 1.6 gigahertz, and, again, the GPU more powerful, has, more shaders, lower clock speed, but still gave you more teraflops in terms of computing power, and 8 gigabytes of basically one pool of memory, GDDR5 memory, and I want to say it was 176 gigabytes a second, which is plenty, really, for full HD 1080p gaming in an optimized, situation like a console. So, not a bad box at all, but for the most part with these these consoles, the end user experience, whether you're watching a Blu-ray disc offline, obviously they look the same, you're getting full HD Blu-ray playback, whether you're playing a game, you may have had certain situations on the PlayStation 4 where there's a lot of non-player characters on screen, games like Assassin's Creed or Hitman, etc., where the CPU became the limiting factor there. The games became CPU bound, and you have dips in frame rate due to the CPU being a little bit less powerful than the Xbox One. In certain games, you see boost in resolution on PlayStation 4 games over Xbox One games because of the increase in GPU power. But for the most part, in terms of what's being rendered on the screen, effects, textures that shipped on the disc are identical. All the game assets, all the data is identical for the most part. Of course, and there are exceptions as always. Games like Grand Theft Auto both rendered at full HD on both boxes. You had a little bit of extra GPU power left over on the PlayStation 4. You could render some thicker grass, which is a minor difference, but a difference nonetheless. You have situations where again, the CPU and even the ES RAM, as quirky as it is, has some advantages in terms of latency and bandwidth over the PlayStation 4 to enable certain things. Like recently, I think we saw a title that was, I think it was Prey, where screen space reflections were enabled on the Xbox One version, and they weren't even present on the PS4 Pro version because of just, it probably was one of those things that was pretty much free to performance because of the ES RAM on the Xbox One. But again, for the most part, the overall experience of those two consoles was largely similar. Now here is the meat and potatoes of the video, and I know we're already a bit ways in, but I'm gonna get to it. I don't mind. I appreciate you guys sticking around for these long videos, but here we go. Here we go with the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4 Pro, and why this is the largest gap in technology and the overall experience to the end user, offline, online. Whether you're playing optical media or a game, that I've seen in 15 years since the first Xbox and the PlayStation 2. So, starting with the CPU, I mentioned that the Xbox One and PlayStation 4, and the same is true of the PS4 Pro, they are based on AMD's Jaguar CPU cores, which are basically low power, really meant for like tablets. They are that low power, that low TDP, and there's two of those kind of stitched together to give you 8 cores. Now these are all of this stuff is semi-custom. So there's little things that Microsoft or Sony will work with AMD and say, hey, listen, we'd like to add another, something here or something there to kind of change the CPU or the GPU or whatever. But for the most part, very similar architectures between all three of those consoles. That includes the Xbox One S, by the way. But you've got a 2.1 gigahertz version of that CPU, essentially, on the PlayStation 4 Pro. On the Xbox One X, if you just looked at the specs, in a lot of these sites, it'll say Jaguar custom SoC or custom CPU. Doesn't really tell you the whole story. Their clock speed is only 200 megahertz apart. So you don't see a large disparity there, but you have to realize in this last year that we've had, AMD in particular as a company and their technology have seen major strides in CPU technology as well as GPU technology, etc., etc. So this is not, to be clear, a Zen-based CPU, a Ryzen-based CPU. But again, these are all semi-custom solutions. And Microsoft, without going to Zen, which they really didn't need to do because the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4 Pro really being the low man on the totem pole with its slower CPU, still has to be taken into account by developers. They have to program so it at least runs on a 1.6 gigahertz, Jaguar CPU. So they didn't really have to go with a crazy Ryzen 8-core, 4 gigahertz CPU. But this 2.3 gigahertz CPU in the Xbox One X is not a Jaguar-based CPU, not a true Jaguar-based CPU. It's a completely custom solution. If you look at the gains in performance in both instructions per clock, in terms of efficiency, with the older AM3 Plus AMD APUs versus the new Excavator APUs that currently work in the new AM4 boards, there was like a 30% gain there in terms of performance per clock. And I'm not saying that you're going to see the same 30% increase here in IPC over what's available in the PS4 Pro, but the fact is it's a newer, more evolved version of AMD's process, of their architecture, and it's going to punch above its weight relative to all of the other consoles, again, by sheer virtue of the fact that it's a newer, more highly refined and developed architecture. So that's going to allow for things that, higher frame rates in games, faster loading times in games, more non-player character-driven things on the screen that have AI scripting going on. You'll be able to have, denser populations and open-world titles, less scenarios where things are CPU-bound. If, there's a situation where it's CPU-bound on the PlayStation 4 Pro, it likely will not be on the Xbox One X because, again, higher clock speed and also a newer, more refined design with that CPU. Now, the GPU is just as important. And again, if you guys watch this channel, if you follow PC news at all, and even if you don't, I'm just going to tell you flat out, again, AMD's had a lot of progress with GPUs in the past year. And since the PS4 Pro launched, and PS4 Pro, as far as I know, does implement, even before, it came out before Polaris, does implement some of the technologies implemented in Polaris. So like I say, Sony, Microsoft have access to AMD's entire treasure trove of technologies coming in the pipeline. They can say, hey, listen, we'll give you a few more bucks if you incorporate this upcoming technology into our custom chip. And the PS4 Pro's GPU, it does include texture compression, delta color compression. It comes in, packing 4.2 teraflops of computing power, but the Xbox One X GPU, again, it's a year newer. It's going to incorporate things from Polaris. It's also going to incorporate things from Vega, or at least it's very, very likely that it does. A lot of this stuff is under, NDA, non-disclosure agreement and stuff like that, but it would make sense if, and they do all the time, like I say, they reach into the pocket and say, AMD, bring out your newest stuff and implement it into the architecture of our chip. Either way, it's a year newer. It's going to have newer, again, more refined, implementing newer technologies, etc., into the GPU, coming in at 6 teraflops and going to punch above its weight again because it's newer relative to the 4.2 teraflops on the PS4 Pro. So a 50% increase in GPU power, essentially, even more powerful than the numbers will suggest, just as the CPU was. Now, this is going to give us stuff like increased geometry, higher polygon counts on characters in games. If developers choose to use the power in that, for that, they could use the power for better shading, more advanced lighting, more advanced ambient occlusion, other graphical effects, whatever they feel like. Microsoft has always said developers can use this power however they see fit, which we'll get to here in a little bit as well. But if they want to use it for resolution, I heard some people commenting at E3 recently. Certain games aren't going to be true 4K. Microsoft was lying to us. Well, that's not true. If you guys go back to E3 last year when they announced the Project Scorpio Xbox One X, they made it clear from the start developers can leverage this powerful box however they see fit. And although I wouldn't be surprised if every single Microsoft first-party title was native 4K, and a lot of third-party titles were native 4K as well, they're not going to tell developers that they have to spend that budget of power on sheer resolution. If they want to spend, some of that power on, again, higher polygon counts, better lighting, etc., they can certainly do that. So, but the GPU is going to make a huge difference there. Coming out of the GPU, this may sound like a negligible thing, but the output's going to your TV. I didn't mention this on the PS4 and Xbox One, but those both shipped with Parity, HDMI 1.4b would give you, basically full HD 1080p video or gaming to your TV. The Xbox One X, no, sorry, the S and the PS4 Pro both use HDMI 2.0. That gives you a bump up from like 10 gigabits a second on the Xbox One and the PS4 in terms of bandwidth in the cable to like 18 gigabytes a second using HDMI 2.0. And that enables 4K at 60 hertz with HDR, although using true 10-bit color, 10-bit HDR with 4K 60 hertz can cause some quirkiness there. So, but it's not like either of those consoles are pushing those graphics anyway. And with regard to media playback, the PS4 Pro is stuck at 1080p anyway with the Blu-ray player. The Xbox One S can utilize that 4K playback at least for ultra high definition Blu-ray disc, but the Xbox One X has HDMI 2.1, and it sounds again like a small difference. 2.0 on the PS4 Pro, 2.1 on the Xbox One S. What's 0.1? It's nothing. Well, the bandwidth goes from 18 gigabytes a second on the HDMI 2.0 cable up to 48 gigabytes a second using HDMI 2.1. Now that enables some absolutely ludicrous things. That enables 4K at 120 hertz with no problems. I think it's a dedicated channel they provide for HDR, 10-bit true 10-bit color HDR, and you can even do up to 8K 60 hertz, which I don't think they're ever going to do that. I don't even know if there's any TVs in the pipeline that are 8K resolution. But the one thing it enables that is really a game changer, literally a game changer, on top of the added resolution and frame rate possibilities, you get variable refresh rate technology. Now, these are technologies like NVIDIA's G-Sync, technology like and what's implemented in the Xbox One X. FreeSync 2 specifically is implemented in the Xbox One X. This is frame synchronizing technology that basically allows a compatible display to never display torn frames, to not give you any input lag if the GPU, for whatever reason, or the system can't hit the target frame rate, and you skip frames here or there on a PlayStation 4 or an Xbox One or any console before any console before the Xbox One X, you would see one of two things. You would either see frame tearing, and that's when VSync is disabled, and basically the GPU says, well, I know it's time for me to give you a new frame. I've only got a quarter of it rendered, so we're gonna keep the half of the frame that was previously there, and I'm gonna put what I have rendered on the bottom part of the screen, and you just see a huge tear. Like if you're turning right, you might see like, where you were up here and then where you're going on the bottom quarter of the display. It's horribly annoying. Or if they have VSync turned on, you get input lag. It's like it's waiting for the GPU. It literally is waiting for the GPU to render that next frame. So you're pulling on the controller, but you experience lag in input and responsiveness because your system is not meeting up to the frame rate which is expected of it in that game. So having FreeSync 2, having HDMI 2.1 just further future-proofs this box and makes it so if you have a TV that has this technology in it down the line, which I fully intend to have, you're going to be able to play games and never have to worry about input lag, never have to worry about torn frames. It's going to be a new world in terms of a gaming experience just because of the output. Now, optical media drive. I mentioned this. The Blu-ray player and the PS4 Pro will only do full HD playback, which is completely true. It's a 50 gigabytes, of data capacity per disc, per Blu-ray disc. It's been around since, hell, even before the PS3. So it's been around for 10, 11 years, Blu-ray players have. And again, that's fine. It's enough data capacity there with 50 gigabytes of data capacity per disk to hold the assets the PS4 Pro needs to render. The PS4 Pro really isn't... I skipped over some shit. I'm going to go back. Before I cover the optical media drive, I've got to cover the memory subsystem. And this is what I had numbered, but I screwed this up, so sorry. But here we go. The memory subsystem, I told you guys on the Xbox One and the PS4, pretty close to the same. They both had the same amount, 8 gigabytes, 8 gigabytes of total system RAM. The only difference was, DDR3 on the Xbox One, GDDR5 for the PS4 Pro, which the Xbox One kind of makes up for that with the ES RAM. But the memory subsystems, at least in terms of capacity, and you can argue bandwidth there, there's certain arguments either way, but they were largely the same. Now the PlayStation 4 Pro, on a lot of spec sheets it's listed at 8 gigabytes of system RAM, which is not entirely true. There really is 9 gigabytes of RAM on that console. Mark Cerny came out and said, we are aware that rendering at higher resolutions, having more, GPU horsepower, 4.2 teraflops of, computing power on the PS4 Pro, we're going to be able to render some higher resolutions than we can on the PS4. So we're going to add 1 extra gigabyte of DDR3, basically for like system and operating system use, and which is great because it's lower latency memory, so it's great for that. And we're going to free up about another half gigabyte for developers to use in games. Now, all of these systems, this is very important to remember, Xbox One, Xbox One S, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 4 Pro, and the Xbox One X, although it seems more optimized on that console, there's going to be a certain amount of that memory that has to be taken up by the operating system, background tasks, etc. So the bottom line is that the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4 had about 4 gigabytes to 4.5 gigabytes available out of that 8 gigabytes of memory for developers to use in their games. The PlayStation 4 Pro, again, getting about a half gigabyte additional, freed up because of that, 1 gigabyte added on. I know the math doesn't work out there, but that's what developers have actually said. You get about another half gigabyte of free, VRAM or RAM they can use as video RAM in the game. So what you wind up with is the PlayStation 4 Pro gives developers between 4 and 5 gigabytes of memory that they can allocate strictly for use in the game and holding in game assets and textures that they're going to render from. They get about 4 or 5 gigabytes of that memory available in games to developers to use in games. Now the Xbox One X, there's 12 gigabytes of GDDR5, and there's a massive disparity here in bandwidth. The PS4 Pro, the GDDR5 in that system has 218 gigabytes a second of memory bandwidth, which is a marginal improvement over the 176 in the PS4 Pro, and even with delta color compression, texture compression, is not enough for really true high resolution, 4K gaming. They can checkerboard and they can upscale, etc., even beyond checkerboarding, but that's just not a big enough pipe, a big enough straw to really push data through for higher resolutions. And I think it's a little bit low relative to the GPU power, even in my opinion, at least for that system. That's kind of a pinching point on that system, in my opinion. But the Xbox One X, 12 gigabytes of GDDR5, a 384-bit bus, which all the other consoles in this generation utilize a 256-bit bus. So you come up with 326 gigabytes a second of memory bandwidth with more advanced color compression, texture compression, and that is a ton of bandwidth. That's enough for 4K gaming. I'm telling you right now, in an optimized environment, a console, that amount of bandwidth with, again, delta color compression, texture compression, will enable you to push. It'll give you a bigger and a more optimized straw to push stuff through. On top of that, Microsoft have said we're going to clear up 9 gigabytes of that 12 gigabytes of physical memory for developers to use in the game. So literally twice the amount of memory with way more bandwidth, better technology is going to be available for developers to use in their games. So you're going to be able to have room in there for more game assets. You're going to require less loading off of the disk, off the hard drive, or I don't think anything loads off of the optical media drives anymore. But less game streaming of assets in games because there's a larger pool there to begin with. You're going to be able to fit in ultra high resolution 4K textures or even higher resolution textures to be pushed in there, and it's just going to allow for a lot more to fit into that space. Getting back to the optical media drives, PS4, PS4 Pro, Xbox One, all Blu-ray disc. 50 gigabytes of data per disc, full HD video playback. The Xbox One S, ultra high definition Blu-ray disc. The Xbox One X, ultra high definition Blu-ray disc. Twice the capacity. You get 100 gigabytes of data capacity per disc as opposed to 50 on the Xbox One, PS4, PS4 Pro. And that's cool for the Xbox One S because it does enable playback of native 4K, offline optical media disc. But it's really cool and necessary, really, for the Xbox One X. And the reason for that is that all of those 4K textures with which that box certainly can handle, are going to require higher resolution textures, more game assets, or at least, they may have higher quality cutscenes, video scenes that don't have to have compressed video that can be rendered in true 4K on those consoles, but it leaves a lot more room on the disc for higher resolution, higher quality assets to be put into our games. So the optical media drive, and of course the offline playback as well of true 2160p 4K video, as opposed to if you have a 4K TV and a PlayStation 4 Pro, you're just getting upscaled 1080p video, from your Blu-ray disc, and that's a massive massive increase in resolution. So to kind of go over the advantages, other than what I just talked about, the specs of the two systems that really don't have any areas of parity at all. I'll talk about the Xbox Live advantage here in a minute, but you have to basically take into account that there are features you can get on the Xbox family of products that you can't get on the PS4 Pro. Some of those include backward compatibility. It's very, very possible for Sony to add that to the PlayStation 4 Pro or the PlayStation 4. Those are both x86 architecture boxes, and if Microsoft can create emulation software, for the Xbox 360, and probably a lot easier for the regular first generation Xbox being x86 architecture as well. But Sony could, if they wanted to, create emulation software, and it's a very pro-consumer move, in my opinion, from Microsoft to say, listen, we're going to let you play any of the games that you own that we're making compatible for the Xbox 360, for the first generation of Xbox, on any of these Xbox family of devices, Xbox, Xbox One X, Xbox One S. If you own the game digitally, it becomes compatible or is compatible, it'll download or show up in your queue automatically. All of your save game data, all of your achievements, everything is there for you in the cloud. So if you haven't played the game in 15 years, it's an old Xbox game, and you hop on, you pick back up right where you left off in your old save game, your old character. All your achievements are right there, which is amazing. You can even go so far. I think they said you can even system link. The emulation software is so good. You could even system link with a LAN cable, like an Xbox, an old Xbox, an Xbox 360, and a brand new Xbox One X if you wanted, and they would all work with a compatible game in System Link, which is nuts. I realize Sony makes a lot of money making players that probably own a lot of the games they're playing on PlayStation Now stream games, but it's not the same thing. They don't have access to any of their previous save game data. They don't have access to any of their trophies or their progress. You get latency because your input information has to go all the way to the server, get processed, come back to you all over your internet connection, and it's streamed back to you in a compressed 720p video format that just doesn't look very good. And having those games be compatible and downloadable, with everything accessible. You can even just put the disc in if you have it on an Xbox One X or S or regular Xbox One for any of these old games, and it just will play, is an awesome move from Microsoft, in my opinion, and a big differentiator there. Another thing, I'm going to go over the networks real quick here first. The amount of money that PlayStation and Sony have invested in PlayStation Network, it pales in comparison, honestly, to the amount of money that Microsoft has invested in their online infrastructure. They call it Azure. And Azure is basically the aggregate of all of Microsoft's online computing resources, networking resources, security resources, and on and on and on. And it is so much more robust. There are so many more data centers that exist that are owned by Microsoft and run by Microsoft. And the reason that this massive disparity exists in terms of these two networks is simple. PlayStation Network exists to enable multiplayer gaming for PlayStation console customers, period. That's it. And that's totally fine. But Microsoft's online infrastructure, Azure, exists to service huge, massive enterprise customers for things like software as a service with Office 365. It serves those same customers as well as regular everyday consumers like ourselves for things like OneDrive, for data storage, cloud storage. It has very strict legal agreements, SLAs, service level agreements with these companies in terms of they have to maintain 99.99% uptime. They have to keep their information safe. So they have a ton of money invested in this to keep these services up and running, to have the power to run these for huge business clients that have tens or hundreds of thousands of employees using these services on their cloud network. So the security is much better. The amount of computational resources to be able to do things like host dedicated servers is available. And they only use a very small portion of the overall infrastructure for Xbox Live. And that's even taking into account them basically giving dedicated servers to every single first-party title and really anybody who wants it when you're on Xbox. A lot of developers don't take advantage of that because they want parity, and then they wind up with peer-to-peer networking crap because Sony won't pony up for the money for additional servers to host dedicated servers on PSN, which is a shame. But that's a big differentiator. There is the network itself, and that's why. Now, cool things that really enables, and this is kind of more enabled by the software development and how it's very similar between Windows 10 and the Xbox One family of devices. Universal Windows platform. It's very easy to enable things like cross-play. I know that Sony does that with the PS4, PS4 Pro. Surely there will be some titles where they'll be able to play against PC gamers. But it's a very easy thing in terms of development to get cross-play, cross-platform gaming up and running with an Xbox console and a PC, at least a Windows 10 PC. I gotta get my screensaver fixed here, guys. I apologize, but I'm just gonna turn them off. Anyway, that's a massive differentiator there is, crossplay will come to a lot of titles on the Xbox One, the Xbox One X, Sea of Thieves, Gears of War, major titles. I don't know if they'll do it with Halo, but there's a bunch of major games out there. I think you can do it with Forza as well, where you could be driving along, on your Xbox, and your buddy who's sitting there in his office on his PC, rolls up in a car next to you, and he's like, "Hey, I'm still at the office, but I'm playing on you I'm playing with you on Xbox Live on my PC." That's super cool. Speaking kind of to that point, they have the Play Anywhere initiative, where Microsoft says, "Hey, if it's a first-party game, and you're buying it for the Xbox or you're buying it for a Windows 10 PC, we're going to give you copies for both for the same price." So you buy it once, you can play it on your laptop, you can play it on your office PC, you can play it at work, you can play it on your buddy's Xbox if you log in, you can play it on your Xbox One X in your living room, you can play it wherever you want. Again, all your data is saved and secure in our cloud, and I wish that was possible for everybody. I'd love to buy, like Star Wars Battlefront on the PC and have them give it to me for free on the Xbox, which will never happen. They're not incentivized to do that by any stretch of the imagination. But it's cool Microsoft does that, and it's one more benefit. The last thing I want to talk about here real quick, and people are going to kind of knock this category a little bit. Some people will. Even though it's become kind of Sony's agenda to push this whole Sony TV thing now, which I think is hilarious. People kind of are embracing that, and they'll still refer back and knock Microsoft for trying to aggregate media with the Xbox One. But HDMI pass-through allows the aggregation of media into one user experience. You don't have to sit there if you want to watch TV on your Xbox One, your S, your X. You don't have to go, like when you would on your PS4, HDMI 7 to get back to your cable box, and then you get back to HDMI 3 and your game isn't paused and your guy's dead. It totally pulls you out of the game experience. It's a lot harder to multitask. It's old-fashioned. It's archaic on the PlayStation consoles. Not having an HDMI pass-through. Having that on the Xbox family of devices, you can hit your home button, watch TV, and it pauses your game automatically. It knows what you're doing. It doesn't pull you out of the experience. There's no having to use your emotes to fiddle to change inputs. Everything is aggregated in a single user experience, in a single user interface, and it keeps you more immersed. Whether you're watching TV, whether you're playing a game or using an app, etc., it's all at your fingertips. Speaking more to that is device control. The Xbox One S, the Xbox One X both include IR blasters. So you can walk into your house, turn your Xbox on with your controller, your Xbox One S or your Xbox One X. And the Xbox One, which, if you have a Connect 2.0, you can do that, which that device will work on the other two consoles as well. But, it'll turn on your Xbox, obviously. It'll turn on your audio receiver if you have one. It'll turn on your cable box if you have one. It'll turn on your TV. It'll turn on whatever you have. And again, you don't have to go to your remotes to eat, your 7 different remote controls power on, HDMI number, whatever. It's all just right there. You can control your volume. I fully intend, people still make fun of the Kinect, 2.0, Microsoft spying on you like your cell phone doesn't already have, 1,000 cameras and microphones on it. That'll, you give apps permission to every day to listen to whatever you want, your contact list. But of course, evil Microsoft spying on you with the Kinect. But you can turn the camera off. But I fully intend on using that. I find the Kinect 2.0 to be an extraordinary, differentiator in a positive manner that enables functionality that you can't get otherwise. I like being able to walk into a dark, I have a condo, it's my home, but I can walk in and say Xbox on, and the Kinect goes, I just heard that, tells the Xbox, in this case the Xbox One X I'm going to plug it into, and it's going to turn on all my stuff, and even in the dark, it's going to bathe me with infrared light, and it's going to know who I am. and it's going to say, "Welcome home, Josh. Here's all your stuff. Have a ball." You know, if I'm sitting there on the couch with my buddies playing a game, and I get a call, or you know, something comes out of the microwave or whatever, I can hand the controller to my friend, and the Xbox will know with the Connect 2.0. It'll say, all right, well, now Dave has a controller and Dave prefers inverted controls. It'll change the control scheme immediately. As soon as I hand it to him, it knows he's got it, and his controls are all his stuff is immediately at his fingertips. It's awesome. So, you know, I like being able to call stuff out, like mute, you know, when the phone rings, you know, tell it I want to watch ESPN if I'm playing a game, and it just goes to the app, or you know, goes to HBO or whatever. So I think that's a massive differentiator there, and it's just a higher class of item than you can get with the PlayStation Eye, which is just really a camera. But anyway, guys, you know, those are my thoughts. The Xbox One X, you know, the advantages are clear. Like I say, in every category of hardware, you have enhancements and you have compatibility with all generations of Xbox games. You have, you know, faster loading times than you're going to have on the PS4 Pro. You're going to have more stable frame rates, less CPU-bound, you know, situations. You may have more non-player characters, more dense worlds, you know, greater draw distances, level of detail, higher you know, in-game assets that are being used, which haven't been done in a long time. There's twice as much memory available, and there's the processing power there to be able to push through higher quality assets in the game that make the game world look way, way, way better. You're going to see higher resolutions because of the, again, you know, the GPU and the memory subsystem are just more robust, a lot more robust, and they're newer. You're going to see, you know, developers also use that power in different ways. Not every title will be true native 4K, but they're going to look the best of any console for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. You guys have to understand the last generation was 10 years long. This one will probably be even longer because both these companies now have a ton of money. They're on the second revision of the first console they had out. You know, the Xbox One S and the PS4 Slim. They have the PlayStation 4 Pro. They have the Xbox One X coming out. They have a ton of money invested in hardware. They have a ton of money invested in software development for these you know, family generation of devices. So it's going to go on for a long time. And if you guys want more proof, or just to hear somebody else say it, look at any of the developer interviews from E3 or otherwise talking about the differences between the Xbox One X and the PlayStation 4 Pro. Look up some articles, do your own research, but they'll all tell you the same thing. It is the biggest gap, the biggest disparity in terms of technology that we've seen in 15 years, in 3 generations, possibly, you know, maybe ever. You know, I don't know, you know, going back to the old cartridge-based systems before that, if there was ever a gap in technology this big. But it's the biggest one that certainly I've seen in a long time. And if you're buying one of these boxes, I would implore you to get the Xbox One X. I think it's going to cut down, if you're a PC player especially, on the amount of money that you have to spend on games. There's going to be some awesome first-party titles that will be, you know, cross-play enabled, that will be play anywhere enabled. Buy it once, play it on all your machines, wherever you happen to be. Backward compatibility, you know, not having to pay to stream the games you already own. A really robust and secure online network. And, you know, it goes on and on. Aggregated media experience, device control, etc. It's just absolutely night and day. And once again, I thank you guys for, you know, joining me for this long video. And again, I'm sorry for the haphazard nature. And, you know, I know everything is not as it could be if I had more time to do, you know, some of the stuff I wanted to do in terms of you know, prolonged mirror work. And I'm sorry about that. But hope you guys enjoyed it nonetheless. Thanks for following along as always. Peace out. I'll see you in the next one.